Okay. So, yeah, how is everybody doing? I'm curious to know if everybody is doing more or less ceramics these days. I have been kind of like on this a little bit of a motivational roller coaster where like I don't, my energy levels just have been up and down, and some days I get a lot done and other, some days, weeks or days go by and I don't do anything. Like it's just kind of a crazy time. So yeah, I'm curious if you want to share like how things have been going for you, or we can just talk ceramics. Totally up.
Hi, I'm Stephanie.
Yes.
From Southern California.
Hi, Stephanie.
Hi there. I'm like you, up and down. Yes, this week I said I was in the doldrums of the wind had stopped, but
yes.
But I've been making a lot of stuff, and I've also been doing a glaze seminar with Matthew Katz.
Okay.
That's been really good. And my ceramics class has gone online.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Like you're pottery making, or what kind of class?
It's a pottery making class
okay.
at a college, a community college.
Yeah.
And we've gone online. So we've been working on like getting our Instagram accounts up and
oh, nice.
thinking about selling but
yeah.
So we've been thinking about other things, and a lot of us have wheels, but a lot of us don't have kilns. So
right.
I've got a lot of greenware building up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Me too.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you don't have a kiln yourself.
I have a small electric one that hasn't been wired in yet.
Okay.
Because it fits into the dryer plug, but there's not enough ampage.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough. Yeah, so you would have to do get some electrical work done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get any servicemen in right now.
No, it might not be the best time for that.
No.
So keep building up that greenware.
Yeah.
Have a couple of kiln loads once you're ready.
Yes. Yeah.
And if your college opens back up again, will you be able to bring your greenware there to be fired?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They have a huge. It's like a huge bisquing kiln, like it rolls out like on a train track.
Mm-hmm.
So it can hold quite a bit, but yeah, there's going to be a lot of greenware to go in once this is over.
Yeah.
From everybody.
Yeah. Well, I've been off work for a bit, but when I go back to work, there's a bunch of, we had spring break camps at the time. They were going on when I work at a rec center as a ceramic studio technician. And so the rec center closed during spring break. And so we have all of this greenware that is just waiting to get bisque fired. But we just wanted to give it a bit of time for, just to have nobody in the studio for a while. And then just know that it's safe to touch all the pots because,
right.
I went in there and I just didn't know what I could safely be touching, and like loading a kiln takes enough time that I'm going to touch my face a few times. And I just didn't feel comfortable with that. So we're just giving it a bit of time.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Yeah, I really want to thank you about your research about short clay.
Okay.
It was fabulous. I had a lot of bloating and didn't know where it came from.
Okay.
So you opened my eyes, and it really was nice to do it now differently.
Yeah. So are you referring to like my clay recycling
yes
article? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. really was good, because now
Oh,
I'm
good.
doing it like you told me, and I have much better clay. And I work with
Oh,
porcelain,
nice.
so that's very easy upset. But now it's working all right. So
Oh,
thank
that's
you.
good. Yes, you're welcome. I can post a link to that article in the chat, just in case everyone else wants to check it out. So there is, it's called A Low-Tech System for Recycling Clay Scraps. And in that article, I kind of explain what makes clay short, and so why you can have problems with your reclaim, especially if you're throwing pots on the wheel and then you don't save your throwing water. And so quickly I can just explain that. So when we're throwing on the wheel and we're using sponges, all of the really tiny clay particles end up in our throwing bucket and in our splash pans. And those tiny clay particles are you know, part of what make up our whole clay body. And if we get rid of those, like a clay body needs to have small, medium, and large clay particles. So we have like kilns are very small particles, and ball clay are medium, and like fire clays are large. And so there's other types of clays that our clay bodies are made of. And having all these different size clay particles helps all the particles fit nicely together. And so you have like the large particles come together, and then you have little spaces in between them. And so that's where the small particles come in and kind of fill in those spaces. And the more contact points you have between your clay particles, the higher the plasticity of your clay is going to be. And so when we're throwing on the wheel and then we dump our throwing water down the drain, then we're getting rid of all these small particles and we're keeping all of the medium and large particles. And then that can contribute to short clay. So clay that cracks very easily, like if you roll a coil and then you bend it, it should just bend nicely. But if you bend it and it cracks, that's often because the clay is short. Now it can also do that if there's not enough moisture in the clay. And then the other thing is that clay in itself is like a clay body is made of clay, silica, and also fluxes. And the fluxes are what help the clay to vitrify at the temperatures that we're firing it to. And so if we take a clay body as a whole and we're getting rid of some of the clay, that means that we're increasing the level of the fluxes. And the fluxes tend to be larger particles. The clay are the tiniest particles in our ceramics materials. And so if we're removing some of the clay, then that means we're proportionately increasing the fluxes in our clay body. And then that's why our reclaim can bloat sometimes, because all of a sudden our reclaimed clay has more flux than it's supposed to have, which would lower the firing temperature of the clay. So then we're taking our clay body back to our regular firing temperature. But because there's proportionately more flux, then the clay matures at a lower temperature. And so once a clay body has matured, if you keep raising the temperature, that's when bloating of the clay body occurs, where you get these pockets of air and blisters within the clay body itself.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I had a lot of these problems, and I always thought it was the oxygen in the clay, but it's another thing.
Right. Yeah, no, because the oxygen in the clay can escape as long as the clay has some porosity to it. And so clay is porous until it becomes 100% vitrified. And that means that all of the silica in the clay has melted into glass, and then it traps, if there's any air left, then it becomes trapped in that liquid glass, and then when air is trapped, it expands and then creates those bubbles in the clay body.
Yeah.
So I
Good.
put
Carol,
down
yes.
Yeah, I put down, yeah, that's one of my problems. I thank you, Anne, for bringing that up because that was one of my questions. Definitely, I've been having bloating. I do a lot of reclaim. I do all my little bits. Like I'm really almost neurotic about my reclaim, and I think that's what's happening. So I started, of course, doing a little bit of reading. I haven't read your short clay and recycling clay article, which I will as well, but I started adding, I ordered a 50-pound bag of just powdered clay from Plainsman, and I've started adding some of that to my reclaim. Now, is that a good idea?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
what,
because the powdered clay that you get from Plainsman is a complete product. And so you're replenishing anything that
okay.
has maybe gone down the drain or that you threw away or
Yeah,
yeah.
I haven't fired anything that I've added the powdered clay to. So would there be kind of a ratio? Would it be half and half, or what kind of a addition should I make, you think?
I mean, so are you throwing on the wheel or are you hand
Yes,
building?
and I'm hand building, but mainly throwing
Yeah.
on the wheel.
Yeah. So in my article, I just say like save everything. Um, the throwing water, the water in your splash pans, all your scraps, like all your trimmings. So when you're trimming your pots, you're saving all of that. If you're saving all of that, you shouldn't really need to add anything else, but it's not like it's going to hurt. So is it the same powdered clay as the clay body that you
Well,
regularly use?
yes, it is. I bought, I have two kind of clays that I typically work with, and I bought the two different types of, but I also have another clay. They're all cone 6 clays that I've been working with, the chocolate brown clay, which I'm also throwing my reclaim in there. It makes real pretty colors.
Yeah.
and I'm just mixing everything. I'm kind of the mind that it's all cone 6, and I like the different tones I get from mixing it, and yeah, anyways, so I'm doing that.
So I would probably just add enough, like, so if you have a bucket that's really, really wet, adding enough dry powder to kind of absorb a lot of that moisture.
Yeah.
But I don't see, like, I don't really have a formula or a ratio. I think that, adding a complete dry clay body is just, it's not going to hurt. So, yeah, like whatever you feel that it needs, maybe from a moisture standpoint, would be fine.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's where I've kind of started to head, I think, is just seeing what happens now. And one of my other issues, and I'll let Alan get in here before I say this other issue, but one of my other issues is I really think my kiln it's a new kiln, and I think it's firing hot. My cones seem to oftentimes be pooled, onto my shelf, and I don't know how to restructure the firing.
Oh, okay. Now, do you have a manual kiln or like a digital?
It's a digital kiln.
Okay.
So my programs are automatic. I just punch in, a fast glaze and a slow bisque, and that's kind of all I've been doing. I haven't really gotten into the details of it. It's very new, and yeah, I'm a little bit worried because of all the bloating that I've had in the last couple of kiln loads, and I've ruined quite a bit. So I'm a little bit hesitant on playing too much with it. It's a fairly large kiln.
Okay, so you're like setting a slow glaze firing and you're hitting cone 6 and go.
I'm setting a fast glaze. I'm setting a fast glaze. Yeah, and I've been setting a slow bisque, and I guess that's because I just want to make sure, like, it's I go weeks without my clay dries for weeks before I even put it in my kiln, but and it is pretty dry up here in the Yukon, so I'm not too concerned, but I leave the lid open for a bit to try to let if there's any moisture that may have you know, come in from the outside because I'm vented to the outside. So I try to leave. So I go slow bisque, and I'm not sure if that's even what I should be doing, if I should be doing fast bisque. That part I really don't understand, like the kiln, the operation of the kiln, what the different feeds do to your glazes, what it, you know, like that's a totally different ball of clay.
Yeah.
And some knowledge that I really need to find out more about, and I would be happy to have any pointers from you at the end of this about
I
that.
would love to ask you a question. What's a slow bisque? Do you mean that it's a bisque fire and you dry first?
Well, that's what yeah, I leave my lid open for a few hours and then I shut the lid down, and it's a slow bisque. That's just like I have two options. I have a fast bisque or a slow bisque, and I have a fast glaze or a slow glaze. And I was just really reliant on those preset programs because I've used that kiln before in a studio, and that's what we did. And but I, you know, I wasn't using reclaimed clay and all this different stuff. I wasn't using cones. It just worked. Like those kilns worked for what I was using before, and they're not working for me as I'd like them to work here.
What kind of kiln do you have?
I have a cone art kiln.
Yeah, okay, that's what I use too, and we just changed to digital, so I've been trying to noodling around doing my own programs. Have you putting cones in? Because I found the biggest thing about is that I've got two kilns and they fire a little bit differently, but on each program, to get a cone 6.7, it's way lower than 2320 or whatever, 23, whatever it is. So I had to really work with that. They fire much hotter.
Well, maybe I'd love to chat with you after.
Oh, sure, absolutely,
Chris. About what you've been doing. That might be
I mean, I'm a self-taught podder. I'm very frustrated because I can't go to the studio right now, and I am losing my mind. But yeah, let's chat, because I'm really enjoying just, you know, doing the firings and setting programs and experimenting, and this has just been really helpful. I love being on this little program here.
So I'm just going to put my email address down, and then
super.
Yours.
Okay, I'm in Toronto, so.
I'm in Yukon, Whitehorse. Hello, Canada.
Place I do want to go.
Well,
okay, great.
You got a pot. You got a studio with a kiln. You can come visit, but you have to stay at your distance.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Alan, did you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I guess I consider myself lucky. I've never had a digital kiln. I've always had secondhand, hand-me-down. I have an old Duncan right now I had to play around with the shelves inside because of the lower element wasn't firing right. So I changed it to smaller plates inside so that the circulation was better. And I've always played around with cones. I always set sitters in there, and I had to play around with the sitter itself, the lip, to get it so that it actually fired where it was supposed to be on the inside. So I got it working pretty good now, and that's basically what I've been doing here in isolation. But the other thing about your reclaim that I found, and where I first ran into the bloating, was with some raised smooth that when I look back later, it's cone 5. So I was firing in there at a hot 6, and it was bloating, and that was the first time I ever experienced bloating. And my other clays don't do that because they're, I guess, a traditional stoneware 6. So I'm not having that problem. But the other thing I was going to say is the other benefit to the reclaim is I can stop the drying process. I'm throwing much better stuff now because I seem to be able to use a looser clay, so to speak. So I'm throwing 7, 8 pounds now in big bowls that I've never been able to throw before. It just blows my mind that
Awesome.
I'm able to do this now. I just bought some other Cone 6 clay from Trinity in Dallas, Texas. So it seems to be soft. It's not as soft as my reclaim. And I remember you said something, Sue, about you laughed and made a kind of a half joke about slaking all your new clay or something like that. If my new clay doesn't work the way my reclaim does, that's exactly what I'm going to do, because I set up 2 boxes to reclaim, and with the drying plaster and the sheets and all that stuff, and it just sits in there, and I turn it over every couple of days, and it works fine. I love it. If I can't get the new clay to work right, that's exactly what I'm going to do, because I like it soft like the way it is. Thank you for that.
The other thing that makes clay really perform really well is high-speed mixing. And so there's 2 ways that you can mix a clay body. So you can mix it in a plastic form where you and this is how the clay companies make their clay, is they have these big mixing machines, and they're just adding enough water to the dry powdered clay materials that to create, a mixable clay that's, the consistency that you get it in the bag. But if you bring your clay into a liquid state, and then you're able to high speed mix it with a paint mixer or a drill and a drill, then the clay gets mixed so much better, and those particles become so much more homogenized that your clay reclaim can actually perform better and be more plastic than fresh clay out of the bag, because it's had that opportunity for those particles to be mixed so well. And so bringing your clay into a liquid state, into a slip state, and so having a bucket where you add your throwing water and you add all your trimmings and all your failed pots, and then you're mixing it really well with a drill, you can actually create clay that performs better than the fresh clay out of the bag. So that could be what you're experiencing, Alan, is that just the fact that it gets mixed so well, because dry, clay can only, when it's in the solid form, when it's in its plastic state, there's only so much it can be mixed, and those particles don't move very far from each other. Whereas in a bucket, in a liquid bucket, they can all move around freely, and that's so that's another little tip.
Yeah.
When I get done slaking, the clay looks like mud from like if you're doing tile work or something, or brickwork. It's thick. I can actually put it and turn it upside down and it sticks to it. I mean, it's that thick and that homogenized. I love it. It works really, really well.
Great.
Oh, so good to love our clays.
Yeah.
How do you?
I actually had about maybe 150 pounds of old clay that I had been leaving outside, and it's been frozen 2 or 3 years. And when I read what you said, Sue, I said, okay, I'm going to try this. And I built a couple buckets, and I didn't expect the clay to work, because I heard clay doesn't like to be frozen, which is why when you have clay shipped, they always tell you not to, be careful if it's frozen, yada, yada, yada. And part of the clay, when I cut it open, it actually had big voids inside, and it was short, like you were saying, it was short clay. So all I did is cut it up in chunks, threw it in the bucket, and covered it with water, and then added more. That's when I started adding the bits from my splash pan, and I always did save what was in my throwing water. I always threw that in the bucket, but the slip, I realized that's the slurry that comes off that that's thrown out when you're throwing from the centrifugal force. And I would never even clean that until I was going to change clay colors, but now I change it periodically and throw it in the bucket. So it has really worked well, and I'm very, very happy with it. And I was able to reclaim 150 pounds, 160 pounds, something like that. I mean, it just blew me away. I figured I'd have to waste all that clay and all that money, but it works out fine. For anybody that hasn't tried it, read that. The plaster is easy. You can. I went to a site where it told me if I wanted a 2-inch thick, you know, based on the bucket that I had, you use this much plaster and this much water in it, and I just threw it in the bucket and left it there till it dried, popped it out, and it was perfect. And I even use that. I pull that out if I have clay that's too wet, something where I messed up a pot and it's just too wet, I'll just kind of leave it on that and let it dry for a while, and then re-knead it and start it all over again. I mean, it's good for other uses too. So, and I'm looking forward to getting an automatic kiln, because I would love to be able to do some more things. I figured out how to do manual holes after it turns off. I sit there and I wait for the puppy to turn off, and then 30 minutes later I turn it down a couple of notches and then leave it on for 20 minutes. And I find that my pinholing and stuff like that has gone away.
Nice.
I
So
loved
it's
I
just-
loved our manual kiln. I loved it. I really miss it.
I like it too. I just
I
wish I had
loved
a
it
good
because you could
one.
really
That's
watch
all.
it. You were part of the process, and I just loved it. I'm struggling to get used to this brand new techno stuff, but
Yeah.
yeah, I'd like to have both actually. I'm having a new studio at some point because I'm moving to Nelson, BC.
Ooh,
So yeah,
that's
anyway.
where I learned to do pottery.
The Selkirk
Nelson.
art, really?
Yeah, Kootenai,
Yep.
Kootenai Studio
School of
Arts.
Yep.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah. It's an amazing place.
yeah, I'm super excited.
Nice. Stephanie, I see your hand is up. Did you have
Oh,
something
when
to
you,
say?
yeah, I just wanted to ask about when you're reclaiming your clay, and if you bring it to a slip state, how do you thicken it up? Do you have to get the clay powder?
That's where the plaster that Alan was talking about comes in. So if you read the article, what I do is I create these plaster slabs. And so, yeah, so I get the clays in a liquid state. Then I have these plaster slabs that live in these Rubbermaid totes. And I raise them up on blocks so there's some air circulation around them. And then I lay a sheet over top of the plaster slab. I pour the liquid clay over top, and then I kind of wrap the clay up like a present in the sheet. And so the plaster draws the moisture out. And as Alan was saying, yeah, you flip it over every couple days. And then it'll just kind of, the sheet helps the clay, like the edges of the clay, to not dry out super fast. But the clay will slowly dry out to a point where then you can start wedging it and using it again. So the plaster is what you need to like suck
It absorbs,
sucks
the water out.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sue, the only thing I don't do from your presentation, I didn't take it when I slaked it down. I didn't take it down so that I could screen it. That, to me, I mean, I don't care if there's dog hair or cat hair in mine, it's going to burn out anyway. But I find that I have little bits of plaster in a couple of my pots that I just did. I saw that when they're fired, that burns out. So it leaves a hole.
Oh,
so
yeah.
there is a reason to try and keep all of that clean, which is why I always put a lid on the reclaim bucket. And I try not to pick things up off the floor when they fall and throw in there. But you said to take it down to where I can screen it. To me, that's like an 80, and it's got to be pretty liquid to do that. So yeah, I just, you know, my bucket, I just put the water in there, and then if there's too much water, I take it out before I slake it and add more water till I get it to that consistency. And I don't have, it doesn't flow. I take a spoon and like taking batter out of a cake thing and putting it in there. And then I spread it out and fold it up like you said. And during the winter, it took 3 weeks, almost a month to do because it was cold. But now it's only taken like a week and a half, and I put my finger in it. If it's still sticky, it needs to dry a little bit more. When it gets so that it's not sticky, that's when I start wedging it to get it to where I want it. It's perfect.
Nice.
Cold and so forth. I'm familiar with using them from my past, but right now I have a kiln that has an kilns that are auto fire and that I can programmable. So my question is to everyone, and to you specifically, Sue, is it a best practice, do you think, to include a little cone pack in there? I have not been doing that. I've been relying on and trusting the kiln sitter, and over the last couple of years, it's been just fine. But just wondering if anybody has some comments about that. Should I be more careful about that and use cones as well, just to keep an eye on things?
Well, I'm a
Alan.
big,
Oh.
yeah. I'll just say, like, I'm a big advocate of using witness cones. I think the cone in the sitter is not as accurate as the witness cones. You know, the cone in the sitter is to make sure that the kiln shuts off, hopefully at the right temperature. But I find that there can often be a discrepancy between when the kiln shuts off with the kiln sitter, because I have manual kilns at home. So I use the digital kind at work, but all my kilns at home are manual. And so I always have witness cones in the peephole, and I'm always watching the cones fall and making sure that if the kiln shuts off before my cone 6 is down, I'm turning the kiln back on, because I don't want my clay to be underfired, because if your clay isn't vitrified, then you can have issues with absorbing moisture. And so I'm 100% in the using witness cones camp. I know a lot of people don't use them, and I would like, you know, to spread the good word of using witness cones, because they also help you to troubleshoot. So when you have any, you know, when people in my Facebook group post problems that they're having with their glazes, my first question, and not to be annoying, but just is, what do the cones look like? Because they can help you or someone else help you diagnose most glaze problems and clay problems. They just give you so much information. They give you information about the health of your kiln, as well as, you know, like the quality of your finished product. And so if your kiln is shutting off early, then there's a good chance that your clay is going to be somewhat absorbing moisture, which can you know, promote bacteria growth. If your clay absorbs moisture, you put your pots in the dishwasher, you pull a pot out of the dishwasher and stick it in the microwave, and if there's water within that clay body and it turns to steam, your clay could explode. Like, it's not something that happens all the time, but it is something, like, there is a risk of that happening.
Okay.
So I like, even I use, if I'm firing to cone 6, I will use a 5, 6, and 7, because then if you're underfired, you know how much you're underfired by, and if same as if you're overfired, you know how much, because if you just have a cone 6 and the 6 is completely flat, then you're not sure if it made it to cone 7 or cone 8, or if you come out and your cone 6 is you know, standing up, like, you know, just you want to know whether your cone 5 is already melted. Like, it just gives you so much information. And so I definitely recommend, and even if you can only put a cone 6, like if cost is an issue, because, you know, cones aren't cheap, but even just one cone 6 is better than nothing. And I will often have like the 5, 6, and 7 in the peep where I can see them, but then I'll scatter cone 6s around the kiln, because I like to know if, you know, the top is hotter than the bottom, that sort of thing as well.
Okay.
But I'll let everyone else talk. Alan and then Anna.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I've been reading a lot about how cones work, and the term heat work, which I'm going to leave to you because that's what we're talking about here. But I was reading some old Orton information on cones, and it told me that in the sitter, I'm supposed to be putting one cone higher in my sitter to make sure it turns off properly to match what my witness cones are inside on my shelves. The problem with me is I adjusted my sitter to be the same cone as what I'm getting on my shelf. So I got a real deep sitter. But the other thing that I read was where it turns off, the heat continues to rise. It doesn't necessarily get to cone 6 on the shelves. It's based on how packed you put the shelves, how much stuff you have in there, how dense all your wear is on there. So that's why I also read that when you got a hold, you should wait 15, 20 minutes before you reset your kiln for the hold. Now, I don't know how it does that in the manual or in the automated ones where it automatically does that or not, but it works for me, and I like to reset. All you do is you lift up the sitter that fell down and you punch the button and very gently put it back down, and it'll start again without having the sitter on. I mean, the sitter's on, and all I do when I want it to turn off is just pop it and it turns off. So that answered one question that I saw down here. But I've adjusted my sitter to match what my cone is, but I'd never heard that before from Orton, putting one higher, one in on the sitter than what you're attempting to do. So I'll leave you to heat work, which is a very interesting subject.
Sure. Anna, did you want to say something first? Oh, you're just a sec.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Yeah, I am having problems. I don't use the cones, so yeah. I'm having problems with cracks in my plates. I used to fire them at the quite fast program, which I didn't know it was really fast. And then and everything was fine. And suddenly my plate started to crack. So I did ask like more experienced potter, what to do. So she suggested just to slow the ramp and set up the cooling as well to cool down. So I did that. Because I do hand building, so I use the hand mold. She said stop using the hand mold because that stresses the clay, and then I apply slip on my pieces, so then that extra stress on the clay body and all that stuff. So I stopped using the hand mold, and I was drying really slowly, covering it with the plastic and everything. And then I slowed down the firing, so I changed the schedule of the firing. I set up the cooling, but then I made all these changes, but still I, end up with the crack on the plate, on the bowl. So I really don't understand. I know there's going to be lots of different aspects to cover, but yeah, is there any ideas from you guys that you could, tell me what I'm doing wrong, what I need to, what's causing it? I don't know.
Yeah, I have a question, because I always throw my plates. And one thing I know is that you have to compress.
Yeah, that's what I do. Like, always make sure I use like a rib, I compress it before. Yeah, so
Then I've not a clue.
So I did see your post about these plates that were cracking. And so my idea was, because you're only glazing the one side.
I did glaze outside, like other side as well this time. So I did take that into consideration. So I did glaze on the other side as well, and it cracked as well. And what happened was recently when I did that, obviously, I took out this bowl, and there was a crack when I took out from the kiln, there was a crack, and then I put it on the table, and like 30 minutes later there was like another crack appeared. So I think, does that say that the cooling was too quickly? I don't know.
I don't think it's the cooling. I think it probably has something to do with the thermal expansion of the glaze.
Glaze.
Yeah, because like to me it sounds like it's dunting, and dunting is where the clay cracks because there's just so much tension. And so I was thinking originally that you were glazing the inside but not the bottoms. And so often when you have a wide surface where there's glaze on one side but not the other side, it creates a lot of, the glaze expands and contracts on that one side, which creates tension. And if you don't have equal tension on both sides, then that can cause the clay will fail to relieve that stress. But if you're saying that you've now glazed both sides and you're having the same problems, it makes me think.
And I got, because it's a clay body, it's a black clay body, and I went on the Scarva website, and they said that there is a special the glaze that they made for low expansion glaze for this clay body, which is gonna match, so you're not gonna have any problems with it. And I bought it and I used it and still cracked. So I really don't know what's going on. Yeah.
And are you rolling slabs? Like, are you using a rolling pin or a slab roller?
Yeah.
Okay, so you are compressing the clay. Yeah, because like if you know how you can like throw a slab, you can stretch a slab. So so if that was the process, then that can also create, if you're stretching the slab and then not compressing it afterwards, then that can also create a little bit of tension in the clay body itself. But is this a clay body that you've been using for a long time, or?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And in the past, I haven't had problems, and then suddenly, But it's not only this black body clay, also crank clay I used some time ago, like, cracked as well. And so, so I just don't understand why suddenly all my pieces cracked.
Right. And has anything else changed with, like you have the same kiln, you're using the same process for making?
The same process of making glazes. I've been experimenting with clear glazes, but in the past I just used the same glaze which I made, and I messed it up because I had some crazing and I added some quartz.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
You said you used clay from Scarva?
Yes.
Yes. Is it possible that they changed?
I don't know. Maybe.
Ask them. Because Valentine, I use porcelain from Valentine, and they often change the ingredients. And when something happens to my stuff, and I can't get a hold on what I'm doing wrong, I call them and ask them if they've changed the ingredients. Maybe that's an option to ask.
There's a comment here talking about drying evenly. So how are you drying your plates? Like, is it possible that the edges are drying before the center? Because that's another, usually those cracks happen before it gets into the bisque or after the bisque firing, because you're only getting cracks coming out of the glaze firing, right?
Yes, yeah. When I bisque fire, it's all fine. I never had a problem with bisque firings. I never had a piece to explode or cracked or It's always after glaze firing.
Okay, because it could be that these very small cracks are forming that you can't see before they go into the kiln, and then in a glaze firing they're amplified. But to me, it sounds, you know, like if you're pulling pots out of the kiln and then they're cracking afterwards, to me, that sounds like dunting, which is, yeah, which is an issue between
With
the glaze and the
and clay body.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so I don't have another suggestion at this point.
Hello.
Michael
Yes.
has something to say.
Yeah, well, I've got some problems with things like this and cracking afterwards. But to try and to test this, I make my plates on the wheel, then on the roller, and that way the tension inside of the clay, because sometimes you have a kind of layers inside who make the cracks after all. So maybe it's good to try this. Make a plate on the wheel, take it off, and then stretch it out for making hand builds.
Okay.
Right.
Nice suggestion. Thanks.
So how should we dry? Alan says, so how should we dry plates? So the thing with clay, drying clay, so clay does not need to be dried slowly. So that's often a misconception, is that clay needs to, if clay is dried really, really slowly, then everything's going to be fine. But it's not necessarily that clay needs to dry slowly, it's that it needs to dry evenly. So you don't want the edges of your piece to dry before the center of the piece. And so slowing down the drying does help for something to dry evenly. But the main thing, I think, if you're making, you know, your plates are quite thin and wide, right? And so those thin edges are naturally going to dry out faster. And then the center is going to be the last thing to dry out. And so it's important when you're drying pieces, especially like thin slabs, that you're flipping them over as much as possible. And I wouldn't like wrap them up tight and then not, you know, put them away and hope that they dry really slowly. What I would do is I would, every time you go into your studio, you uncover them because you want to give them air, and I would flip them over. And if you notice that your edges are drying faster than the center, some people use wax resist, but if you can just like wrap the edges in plastic just to allow the center to dry out. And as soon as your piece can hold its shape without, you know, it's firm enough to hold its shape, then you should be flipping it over so it can dry from the top and the bottom. Because if the clay is only drying from the top, so the top of the slab is going to dry faster than the bottom, which also creates tension, and then the edges dry faster than the center, which also creates tension. And so you want it to happen as evenly as possible. So by protecting the edges from drying out too fast, and also by flipping your plates over so that they can dry from the top and the bottom evenly, that just making sure that the drying is as even as possible is going to help, especially with large, wide, flat pieces, because it's really common that the center of that piece is the last part to dry. Everything else, as we know, clay shrinks when it dries. So if it dries from the outside in, it means that the rim is shrinking, whereas the center is still the same. And so then once the center starts shrinking, it's being, the tension is just pulling at that center, and that's where these S cracks form. Even drying over slow drying, I would say, is another tip. But I just have this feeling that this isn't a drying issue, and that it has something to do with the relationship between the glaze and the clay body, or just the clay body itself. You know, maybe it's a bad batch of clay, like, you know, we're all human. Even the people that make our clay bodies are human, and maybe they screwed something up and the clay is just, you know, there's an ingredient that it isn't enough of, and so it's just causing it to fail for some reason. But do you know other potters that are using the same clay body? Like, have you talked to anyone?
No, most of people don't use the black clay that I know of, you know,
Yeah.
locally, so I really don't know.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to say.
Yeah. And do you make other forms as well?
Yeah.
Aside from plates?
Yeah, because I just made I made some kurinuki cups, little cups with the same clay body, and coiled little like a cup or bowl, which was all right, no cracks, no
Okay.
nothing, and it
Yeah.
was the same firing.
Okay. And was it the same glaze as well?
Yes, I did try out 2 different glazes. I used this one from Scava, which was designed for this clay body, and I used another one which I got because I stopped making my own glazes for a moment because I thought it's something what I'm doing wrong. So I bought like glazes from you know, from the shop already made. So I only added water. So yeah, I used these two new glazes, which yeah, work all right on the other pieces, but not on a plate or on a bowl, like yeah.
Yeah. So there's something tension. The other thing is some people will put like silica sand or alumina hydrate, something powdered, refractory material that's not going to melt on their kiln shelves, so that they're wider pieces. So they're like little ball bearings, so they allow when the piece is shrinking during the glaze firing, it has there's less friction as it moves, because sometimes if the piece, you know, it's shrinking like 10% in the glaze firing, and if it kind of gets caught with friction on the kiln shelf, then that can also cause stress that leads to cracking as well.
Right,
So
okay.
so that's something that people often do when they're making really wide flat pieces, is that they sprinkle a little bit of silica sand or alumina oxide, alumina hydrate on the kiln shelves, and then that just kind of reduces the friction as the piece shrinks during the firing. So that could be something to try.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I just wanted to, Yvonne had a question in the Q&A section here. So I was just going to read that out. He says, I made a bunch of decorating slip this week and I find the colors too light and the slip a bit stiff. The specific gravity is 1.39. Is that a solution to deflocculate it, let it stand, and remove a little bit of water and recalculate the specific gravity? Color will perhaps be more intense. The colors are too light and the slip is a bit stiff. Yeah, so my question would be, if you've deflocculated your slip at all to begin with. And I haven't, we make colored slips at the rec center where I work, but I haven't actually measured the specific gravity. So we make, we use a recipe where we mix the dry materials and then we add 70% water by dry weight. And so we just always make it the same. And someone was asking me what we keep the specific gravity at. And you think I would know that, but I haven't actually checked. So when I get back to work, I'm going to see what the specific gravity of our colored slips are. So I'm not sure if 1.39, that seems like it would be really low. And so I think that your question, whether you should deflocculate it, so deflocculating it is going to thin it down so that, yes, you could remove a little bit of water. And the issue is that the slip is a bit stiff. and the colors are too light. So for the colors being too light, yeah, Jacqueline asked what percentage of stain, and you said 3%. And so, yeah, we add 10% stain to our colored slips, but some of them only require 5%. So anywhere from 5 to 10% is going to give you a good color in a slip. So I would maybe try increasing the amount of stain that you're using in the slip. And if your slip is stiff, yeah, like it sounds like it has quite a bit of water in it. So I would, you could try to deflocculating it and removing a bit of water. I would definitely, like, that does sound like a good idea. I'm curious what you mean by stiff. And so if you're in the chat, if you want to maybe clarify what you mean by stiff, like are you having problems with the slip cracking, or is it just too thick where you feel like you want to water it down? I'd be curious to know a little bit more about that. Oh, it's too heavy. And are you making the slip from your clay body, or is it a slip recipe that you're using? That's another question that I have. It's from a recipe. Okay. So, and the other question would be, is how are you applying the slip? So are you dipping? Are you brushing? Is it a slip that you want to have texture, or are you carving through it? That would be another, because slips can be used in different ways. So we add 70% water to our slip. We don't deflocculate it, and it just gets painted on. So that's how people are using it in our studio. And it seems fine. I've found with any more water, if we add any more water, then the slip tends to crack because more water leads to more shrinkage, and then shrinkage leads to cracking. And so that is about how much. So if I wanted the slip to be more fluid, like say for dipping, then I would be deflocculating it rather than adding more water. And so deflocculating it is going to thin it down and make it more fluid. It lowers the viscosity without adding more water. And then, so without adding more water, then you're not increasing the amount of water that needs to evaporate and the shrinkage. So you can have a slip that shrinks very little, but it's also quite fluid. It's too heavy for my use, and if I add water, it will affect the specific gravity. I wouldn't worry about what the specific gravity number is at this point, and slips are different than glazes. So you're not looking for, the same range as a glaze necessarily. But I would just bring the slip to the consistency that you want it to be, and then at that point, and then see if it works. So just adding water to thin it down. See how that works for you. If you're having issues with it cracking, that's when I would go for deflocculating it, because deflocculating it is going to kind of change the way it moves and applies. So it changes kind of the feeling of the slip. And so, but I would, like, without knowing kind of how much water you started with, and without knowing the specific gravity value that we keep our slips at, I would just add a little bit of water if it's too heavy to thin it down a little bit. You're welcome. Carol says, so a good start for slip would be 70% water to 30% dry. No, so I would make the dry materials add up to 100%, and then on top of that, adding 70% water. That's what we do. Yeah. And every slip recipe is going to be different. Ours has a little bit of calcined clay in it. So it kind of depends on how much clay is in your slip, how like the water is going to affect how thick it is. And so 70 is just kind of what we have come to, because more water was just too runny for painting. It was just taking, you know, too many coats to get a good layer, and then less water was just not very, it was just too thick to paint. So that's kind of where we've fallen with that.
So is there a reason why you use calcined clay in your slips?
Yeah, it's to reduce the shrinkage, because clay shrinks when it dries. The calcined clay has been pre-shrunk. And so we, part of our slip recipe, some of the clay has been calcined, which means it's been pre-shrunk so that when it dries, it's not shrinking as much, because slip is mostly clay. And so if your slip doesn't shrink, so if you apply slip to your wet pot, so a freshly thrown pot, that pot is going to shrink a certain amount as it dries, and your slip needs to shrink the same amount. But say you want to apply slip to leather hard clay that's already shrunk a bit, or bone dry clay that's already shrunk quite a bit, if your slip has too much clay in it, then your slip can shrink more than your clay, and then your slip starts cracking. And so I found by replacing some of the clay in the slip recipe with calcined clay, then we've basically pre-shrunk that slip a little bit, like not too much. I think it's around 15% is calcined, and the rest is like there's EPK and ball clay. There's a few different types of clay in there. Is mostly clay, and so just 15% of the recipe is calcined. And that was just like, if you know your process and you always do the same, then you can fine tune your slip to get it to, maybe you're always applying slip to wet pots and you want it to shrink. But because we have a studio with, you know, hundreds of people of all, you know, this person wants to put slip on this pot and this person wants to put slip, you know, like they're putting slip on at different stages. So I found that with calcining a little bit of the clay, the slip becomes a little more versatile, where it works on a wider range of dryness. So our slip can't be applied to bone dry clay that has already shrunk too much, or bisque. So the slip will crack, the slip shrinks too much to be applied to bone dry clay. But if that's something that you want to do, you can increase the amount of calcined clay in your slip recipe so that there's very little shrinkage, and you could even use a slip on bisque or bone dry clay, because it's just not shrinking. You know, the clay has already shrunk, the slip has already shrunk, and so there's just a better fit for that. Just checking the chat here. To make calcined clay, can you just bake it? I put EPK into a bowl in my bisque firing. We actually made jars with lids on them that we calcine our clay at work. So we just have these jars that every time we need to calcine some clay, we fill the jar up with EPK, stick it in the bisque firing, and then it has a lid because the fired powder is very, very light and fluffy, and so whoever's unloading the kiln, we want to make sure that they're protected from breathing that in. So, and then I do have an article on how to calcine clay that I can post a link in the chat as well. And so, oh, that didn't work. Okay, so how to convert kaolin to calcined kaolin. And so sometimes if you're even, so we're talking about slip, but in a glaze recipe, if your glaze recipe has over 20% clay, kaolin, EPK, any type of clay, then I recommend converting some of that clay to calcined clay. So I like to make sure that my glaze recipes don't have more than 15% uncalcined clay in them. So if it's around 20, I'll probably leave it. But if it's, say there's 25% or 30% clay in a glaze recipe, then I'm going to substitute some of that clay for calcined clay, because clay shrinks in a glaze just like it shrinks in a slip, or the clay that we make pots from shrinks. Clay just shrinks when it dries and when it's fired. And so if you pre-shrink some of that clay, then you're going to have less problems with the clay shrinking either while the glaze is drying or while the glaze is being fired. And if the glaze shrinks too much while it's being fired, that's when you get crawling, where the glaze peels away, exposing the clay body underneath.
So what was the, sorry for, I was writing and I didn't catch everything. Is that, what was the percentage of the glaze recipes not having more than 15%?
Yeah, 15 to 20% is about as much uncalcined clay as I would want in a glaze recipe. Okay. So if it was more than 20%, I would, so if it was 25% clay, I would keep 15% uncalcined, and then I would calcine the other 10%.
Okay, cool.
And there is a conversion, because calcined clay has lost some of the water. So clay has this chemically bound water molecule, and when you fire it, that water molecule is driven off. But the water takes up weight, and so to compensate for that, it's about 85% or so. So if you're replacing 10% EPK with calcined EPK, you're only going to add about 8.5% as a substitution, because you need less, because that water has been driven off, you need less of the material to perform what it was originally performing in the glaze recipe. Because part of the EPK that's in your glaze recipe, part of the weight of that EPK is this chemically bound water that isn't actually part of the chemistry of the clay, because it gets driven off during the firing.
Okay.
But my article...
Sorry about that.
Ding, 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 ding. My article explains all of that and gives examples of how to do the calculations and everything. So if you want to read that.
Yeah,
there's more info in there.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Can we see the chat after this? When this goes, I'm kind of a dinosaur.
So I've been getting
Sorry.
That's okay.
My husband.
I've been getting the text chat file that I've been putting into a PDF and then sending out on the Tuesday email. So I have been sending a link to all the replay videos, and then there's also the text chat file that you can download. And then I've also been posting them in the Facebook group. So if you're in my Facebook group, it's called Understanding Glazes with Sue. So I've organized the group into units. So if you click the units section, there's going to be a unit called Glaze Chats, and in there you'll find all the text chats and the replay videos from all of these glaze webinars. So you can find all of that there. And then also in the emails that I'm sending out on Tuesdays, I'm giving links to all the replays and the text chat as well.
Well, you're certainly staying busy.
Yes. Thank you. Oh. I need something to do.
We all appreciate
it. Alan in the chat says, replace 8 for 10, right, Sue? Yes. Oh, I think he's gone. Yeah, replace 8 for 10. It's like 8.4 or something, but yeah, 8 for 10, like 8% calcined clay replaces 10% uncalcined. And that's for EPK. I'm not sure about the other types of clay, but generally that's what I am using is EPK. Okay. So I'm just scrolling through the chat to see if there's any questions that I've missed, or here there's a Q&A section, but if any of you that have your videos on have another question, go right ahead. Okay, I see a question here from Edmund. Can you explain how crystals are formed in tea dust and hare's fur glaze? I've seen Tomoku glazes with what looks like painted swaths of crystals. How is this achieved? I haven't done any work with tea dust or hare's fur glazes, so I'm not actually sure about that. I would guess I believe these are high iron glazes. And so I would assume that the crystallization is with the iron, like the red iron oxide. But to be honest, I can't answer this question. I just don't have the experience with those types of glazes. So if anyone has worked with Tomoku's tea dust or hare's fur glazes, and if you can shed some light on like the crystal formation, that would be great. But I don't have that answer. Just checking the Q&A again. Oh, so Tolga had asked, what is calcined clay? Is it something that you buy? So I think I answered this question. I'm not sure if you got my answer, but calcined clay, you can buy it. I know here it's called Glomax, Glomax, but that's just a brand name, and it's just pre-fired clay. And so I just put my regular EPK through a bisque firing, and when it comes out, it's calcined EPK, and I keep it in a container that's labeled for calcined EPK. But it is something that you can buy, and I don't know around the world what it would be called, but here it's called Glomax. So that is something, yeah, if you are too busy to kind of process it yourself, I'm sure that's something that a lot of people do, is just buy it to have it on hand. Okay, and feel free to jump in if anyone else has questions. I'm just gonna keep reading through the chat here and see if there's any more questions that I can answer. Okay, a lot of talking about drying. So Anna, I don't know if you've read the chat, but there are quite a lot of suggestions and questions for you just about your plates. Hopefully there's some help in there. But you might want to read through that when I send the chat out. Okay, Q&A section I see. Okay, I answered the question. Jacqueline had said, do you bisque in your gas kilns? I'm not sure if she was talking to someone in particular, but we have a gas kiln, and we do not bisque fire in it, but you can. We might actually be getting a Blau kiln. I don't know if you guys have heard of the company called Blau, but they make these super high-tech computerized kilns that basically we have a gas firing, and our gas firing requires, we turn the pilots on, and then we turn the burners on, and we turn the gas up, every half hour we turn the gas up a little bit, and then when we're doing reduction firings, and so we do a body reduction where we reduce the air, and then we put the damper in, and it's a process. It's like a full day. Our firings are usually around 10 hours long, and so we might be getting this Blau kiln that is it'll be a gas kiln, that we can fire reduction or oxidation. So right now we only use our gas kiln for reduction firings, and we only do a reduction firing every 2 months or so. But this new fancy high-tech Blau kiln, it'll be able to do oxidation and reduction firings in the gas kiln, and all of the reduction settings are automatic. And so it's like, I'll set it, I'll say, okay, I want it to go into body reduction at cone 010. That's usually what we do, is when cone 010 starts falling, then we put it into reduction. And so I can program this kiln, and like, so it'll be like meh, and the damper will go in, and the air, like the air flaps will open and close, and it'll do all of this automatically, which I'm super excited to play around with. And the other thing is so we can do regular oxidation firings, and we'll be doing bisque firings using gas. And so the thing is, with gas, if you're doing a bisque firing in a gas kiln, you need to make sure your pots are dry, because that burst of heat, that initial burst of heat, and I'm sure every gas kiln's different, but every gas kiln that I've used, the temperature goes up quite quickly in the beginning, and then it kind of slows down throughout the rest of the firing. But that initial burst of heat is enough to, I've had cone packs explode, which is not the biggest deal, but you could easily, if your greenware isn't 100% dry, you could easily have a disaster. And when I was in school, a friend of mine, she worked for months. She made this huge tree, like coil built tree, and it was like almost as big as she was, and it just fit into our gas kiln, and it was the only thing, it wouldn't fit in the electric kiln. So she's like, I'm gonna bisque fire it in the gas kiln. And she let it dry forever. Like, I think she finished it in February and didn't fire it till April. And it didn't take long, and we turned the gas kiln on, and then all this cracking, like explosion sounds coming from inside the kiln. And she's just like, oh God. And we just let the firing go, and it was pretty sad to open the kiln after, because all this work she had done. So if you are bisque firing with a gas kiln, I just like caution that to make sure that your pots are dry. Put fans on your pots. Fans are like circulating air is the most effective way of drying, because water evaporates into dry air. If the air around the pot is humid from the air that has just evaporated, so you have a mug, and if the air is still, as the mug dries, it creates like a cloud of moisture around the mug, and then that cloud of moisture prevents any more water from evaporating. But if you have a fan that blows that moist air away, then the air in the mug will continue evaporating. So having circulating air as you're drying your pieces, that's gonna help to make sure that they are completely dry. So that's just a little chat about bisque firing explosions, and yeah, and how to dry your pots. Just reading the chat here, dipping my pottery in glaze, what is the basic rule for holding the piece in until you lift it out? So that, Larry, this question is from Larry, and that really depends on the glaze itself. So it depends how much water is in the glaze. So there isn't really like a rule, because if your glaze has more water in it, then you're going to need to hold it in longer to get the same application layer than a glaze that has less water in it. And so as soon as you dip your piece in the glaze, it starts absorbing, the bisque absorbs water, sucks moisture in, and that's what causes the glaze particles to stick to the bisque. And so the longer you hold your piece in the glaze, the more glaze particles it's going to absorb. But the more water you have in your glaze, then the less solid proportionately, the less solid particles you have. And so you're going to get a thinner glaze application. And so what I would recommend is to take the glazes that you have and do some testing where, you know, you could make some really quick pinch pots or something and just like try holding it in, you know, do a 1 second dip and then a 2 second dip and then a 3 second dip, because it really is going to just depend on how much water that you have in your glaze bucket at the time. And then once you have that figured out, okay, you like it best when you hold it in for 3 seconds, it doesn't, you know, you get all those juicy colors, but it's not running. So 3 seconds is perfect. Then you need to make sure that your glaze has the same amount of water every time you glaze. And you do that by measuring the specific gravity. And by measuring specific gravity, you're attaching a numerical value to the water content that's in your glaze bucket. And then you can make sure that your glaze always has the same specific gravity, and then it will always have the exact same amount of water. And so then when your water content is consistent, then a 3 second dip is going to be equivalent to another 3 second dip down the road. But if you're used to dipping for 3 seconds and then 2 months later, your glaze, you know, the water in your glaze has evaporated some, so then you have less water. You do another 3 second dip, all of a sudden you have a thicker glaze layer. Your glaze might run or crawl, or you have inconsistencies there. So measuring specific gravity of your glazes is the best way to make sure that the water content is always consistent, because then you can fine tune your glazing process so that if you glaze consistently, then your results are also going to be consistent. So I hope that's helpful, and I'm just going to post a link to download my free guide for measuring specific gravity, just in case you haven't seen that yet. So I just posted sumacloudceramics.com/SG guide, specific gravity guide, and then there's that'll show you how to measure the specific gravity of your glazes. Did someone have their hand up? Deb. Hi.
Oh, okay, now I'm unmuted. So could you speak a little bit about how you keep your glaze journal? I mean, I read your article that said all the things that should be in it, and we keep our glaze journal by date, you know, what we mixed up and how we did it and so on. But then it's hard to find the last time you mixed it. So do you do it by a page for each glaze, or what?
Yeah. So I have 2 ways of doing things. I have my home way and I have my work way. And so at work, we have 20 large buckets of glaze that we're replenishing every month. And so we're making lots of glazes. Whereas at home, I make glazes a little less often. So at work, we have a binder with a sheet where a sheet for each glaze. And so it's basically got the recipe written out on the left, and then there's a column, you know, there's a few columns for batching it out. And so we'll do like a 10,000 gram batch. So we'll like in that column, we'll batch it out like by multiplying the recipe by 100 to get 10,000 grams. And then, so we have on one sheet, so we write the date. So in October, I made 10,000 grams. And then in November, I made another 10,000 grams. And so we have a sheet for every recipe, and we keep track that way. Whereas at home, I just have my journal, like my sketchbook, and yeah, I just date the pages. And then I have like a color where I highlight the glaze recipe name. So all my glaze recipes are highlighted in pink, I think. And so when I'm flipping through, I can easily find where the glaze recipes are. So it's just a little less organized because there just isn't so much glaze mixing. But yeah, I definitely recommend if you're mixing a lot of glazes, then yeah, just having a binder where you keep all your recipes and you're batching them out just just in that one place. And so you're not cluttering it up with all your other notes about the glazing process and stuff.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
Chris?
That brings me to, I'm just trying to figure out a good log for the kiln for each firing, and
Yep.
what to actually put on the list. We have it's only a 20 member studio, but I've been doing most of the firings, but I'm just trying to just get some ideas about, I don't want to make it big and cumbersome because a lot of people don't know a lot about it. They just want to check boxes off. So if you have any thoughts about that, that would be great.
Yeah. And you have digital kilns?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Okay. So at work, what we do is we have a sheet for each kiln. So we have kiln A, kiln B, and kiln C. So every time we load up kiln A, for example, we'll write the date, whether it's a bisque or a glaze firing. So we'll just do a little B or a G.
Yep.
And then after the firing is finished, we record it gives you the length of the firing on the screen. So we record the length of the firing, and then we record the cones. So how we just draw the cone pack.
Okay, that's exactly what. And then I just put a little bit in there for notes for if there's any issues or anything. Yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah. And so if it looks underfired, I'll just write underfired so I can easily see that. And usually, like if we have a glaze kiln underfires twice in a row, then I might adjust the top temperature of that firing. And yeah.
I thought that was enough. I just thought, am I missing something? Okay, good.
Yeah. And then at home with my manual kilns, I'm there, recording the time that I
that's what we used to have, all of that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then with the gas kiln, for each firing, I have a whole sheet of notes because I record the time that I turn, adjust the air, adjust the gas, adjust the damper, all those things I keep track of. Yeah. So
great.
Yeah. And Deb, did that answer your question about with the glaze recipes, keeping track of them, or do you have any more questions about that?
Well, in your article about glaze journaling, and you're saying, take notes of how much overlap, take notes of how many glazes and all those kinds of things. We're just trying to work out the best way to have all of the information sort of searchable. Well, not really searchable because I don't want to do it digitally, but to be able to find it again, right?
Right. I mean, it kind of depends on like the way your brain processes information. So you could have a section, you could get one of those, like a binder with sections. So you could have a section for because in my glaze journal article, I've got so you've got your glazing process notes, and then you've got your firing notes and your kiln unloading notes. So you could have a section for each of the processes. I tend to just go by day. And so because when I'm thinking back, I'm thinking back of, that time where I was making these types of pots, and so the way I associate in my brain, what I'm looking for is kind of based on the date rather than the process. So you could you could just have it all together in chronological order, or you could just have a different section for each of the different processes.
Well, I tend to do it photographically now in the Pottery Logbook app.
Okay.
It has a lot of spaces to fill in all the notes and so on. And I do that more by date too. It works pretty well. But
and then can you search your notes for words and that sort of thing? So if you have a bunch of logs.
No, I don't think it's searchable inside there.
Okay,
but,
so you just kind of.
But I can take a lot of pictures. I can put many additional pictures in one piece, so I can see exactly and go back and see exactly what was there. So as long as I know what the piece is and basically when I did it, like you were saying, then I can find it that way.
Yeah, and that would be great to have all of that together. So you have this one piece, so you've got your glazing notes, and then pictures while you're glazing, and then you've got, when you're unloading the kiln, then you're taking pictures of the finished piece, and if all of that is together, so you can like look back and see how this process affected this result, because that's the reason for all the notes, is so that you're like, okay, I did this over here and this is how it turned out, and so I learned something from that.
Right.
Yeah. So it sounds like you've got a pretty good system, I think.
It would be more useful, but it's not bad, I guess.
Yeah. Okay,
thank you.
but yeah, I tend to like write everything down, and then I also take pictures, but so I have like just folders on my computer with all the pictures, but yeah, it's not as organized and like, where I have like all the information from one specific piece in one place. I kind of have to like look for the pictures or read the notes, that sort of thing.
Well, that's what I was trying to get away from, because my brain doesn't work well enough to pull all the separate pieces together.
Right. There's an app, or like if you like the digital methods, there's this app or program called Airtable, which is really useful, where it's like a database program. So you can upload pictures and you can tag things, and you can attach all this information, and then you can kind of cross-reference. And so you could, like, if you tag, like if you make an entry and that this is your process, and then you make another entry about the same pot, so you give it this tag, and then you can like see all the information that has one tag together. And so you could see all the notes and the pictures. And so that could be another piece of software that you use to kind of keep track of everything. But I just, when I'm in my studio, like I don't want my computer in there, and my phone's pretty good now, where it's kind of dust and waterproof. They're making phones better these days. So I don't worry so much about like grabbing my phone with clay covered hands, but yeah, I just try, I would rather just like be writing things down. I don't know. Just for like the cleanliness of my digital appliances.
The phone app works pretty well because it's always there and you can go back to it. But the scraps of paper tend to float around.
Okay, yeah. So having just a book, and then just every entry is on another page, and at least then you're keeping it all together.
Mm-hmm.
I'd go through and rip the pages out and organize them later. I've been known to do things like that sometimes when I have time. Yeah, I love a good organized notebook, but I also work pretty well with my own type of chaos. Like, it's organized chaos, I guess. It might not be organized to the outside world, but I have my own kind of systems for doing things that seem to work. They just kind of evolve naturally over time. Like, sometimes I try to create a system for something because I want it to be so organized and so easy to go back and look. And I find the system is just too cumbersome to carry on with it. So that's why it doesn't work. And just being able to freely write something down without having to make sure that it's in the right section. Because like sometimes I'm like, should I be writing this in the glazing process or the glaze mixing section? And then like
recognizable.
All these decisions that I have to make just kind of affect like the real goal, which is just to make pots and learn things.
Deb, what was the name of the phone app that you were referring to? Can she not hear me?
Oh, Pottery Logbook.
No. Oh, Pottery Logbook?
Yeah, I think she's frozen. Deb, I think you're frozen. Oh, there, you're back. But you're muted.
Unmute myself. I was frozen because I was typing, so I went into a different screen.
Fair enough.
Yeah, so it's called Pottery Logbook, but apparently there's also one for iPhone that has a different name. If you just look for pottery journal apps, there were a couple.
Okay.
Cool. There's an app for that. For everything.
For everything.
The software. Oh yeah, the software that I was referring to is called Airtable. And it's just like, it's like a database program, but it's all color coded and it looks nice and it's really user friendly. It's not like, you know, when I think of a database program, I'm just thinking of text, like lines and lines and lines of text, and but it's actually quite user friendly. So you can use it for scheduling. You can attach dates to things and then look at everything with a date on a calendar, and yeah, it's pretty cool. So that's Airtable. Okay. So we have 20 minutes left. If anyone has more questions, let me just look in the Q&A box here. Okay. Fiorenzo, yes, go ahead. Just unmute, yeah.
Okay. I will start making pottery. I follow a course, of course, for last 3 years, but they don't want to make online course at the moment. So I decided to buy a kiln for myself. That will arrive next week, and I will start to make glazes, of course. And my question is, sometimes I see glazes for cone 5, 6, for more cones. What does it mean? I thought that you have to, you know, for example, by clay, you have to fire it at high temperature to have less water inside and more petrified.
Yes.
So what does mean if I see a glaze 5, 6, cone 5, 6? Is it the same? Do I have to use it for cone 6, or is it overfired if I use it for cone 6?
Yeah, so generally, I think it means that people have tested it at both cones and it has worked fine. So I would fire, like, as long as your glaze doesn't run, like an overfired glaze is going to run. It just means that it's just melted too much to stay on the pot. And so as long as your glaze doesn't run, then I would say that it's fine at that higher temperature. And so I think if a glaze is rated, because there are two things that you want in your fired glaze. You want it to be fully melted, so not underfired. So if, say you fire a glaze to cone 5 and then you fire the same glaze to cone 6, and it's a glossy glaze. At cone 5, at cone 6, it's glossier than at cone 5, then I would be firing that glaze to cone 6, because that tells me that at cone 5, it's not completely melted yet. So, but the only way to really know that is to fire it at both temperatures and kind of compare the difference. But I would always, if you can get to that higher temperature without the glaze running, then I think that is totally fine. And as long as the glaze is melted, so if you are, say you have a clay that's rated for cone 5, and you start using, you know, a glaze recipe that's rated for cone 5 or cone 6.
Or you have to use 5.
Yeah, yeah. And you just want to make sure, I mean, there isn't really a way to make sure, but as long as the glaze is melted, and so if it's shiny, like if it's glossy, then that means that it has melted and cooled into glass. And so matte glazes, it's sometimes harder to tell if the glaze has been fully melted or not. But if the glaze is glossy, then there's a good chance that it's fully melted.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if it has pinholes,
That,
it's not fully melted.
no, you can have over-fired glazes with pinholes. Pinholes show up kind of everywhere. And so that, yeah, that's not an indication that it's underfired or overfired necessarily. Some glazes will pinhole when they're overfired and not pinhole when they're fired to the right temperature. But there's lots of different types of pinholes that you can get in your glazes, and they appear for different reasons. So
I ask you another question.
Yeah.
Makes sense to start making glazes from scratch? So you start making something new, or is it possible to, if you like, I want to use cone 6, but if I find something for cone 7, 8, it makes sense that I change the recipe for lower temperature, or I don't have the same result. Of course, it's not the same, but to try to have the same result of a higher temperature. So I want to make it for lower temperature.
right.
Or
that does make sense. It's a little complicated, especially if you're just starting out. But it is something that's possible as you start to learn about the chemistry and how to manipulate the maturing temperature of a glaze. But I wouldn't start there. I would start with, if your clay is for cone 6, then finding cone 6 recipes. And then eventually you're going to be like, oh, but I really want to try this recipe and it's for cone 8. And then
start safe.
Yeah, start simple. Don't overcomplicate it to begin with, because then you might get really frustrated and quit, or like you want to have some successes before you start like really challenging yourself. I think. Yeah. Hi, Anna. Yes.
Maybe this is a silly question, but I was reading online trying to find out about the cone 6, for instance, the temperature in what's the temperature in your like for you for cone 6? What would be in Celsius?
I would have to check my cone chart.
I think it's 2320, something like that.
Is it?
In Celsius?
Yeah, because that's what I got my kiln with Celsius. So I said, like, I fire to 1250 or 1235. So what would that be? Yeah. Would that be cone 8 or cone where we are with Celsius with that?
So the thing about cone temperatures is that they're dependent on how fast or slow the firing is. And so for cone 6, so I'm just looking at my cone chart here. So it says for cone 6 in Celsius, if you're firing at a slower rate of 60 degrees per hour, and this is for the last 100 degrees of the firing, then your temperature for cone 6 is 1237 degrees Celsius. If you're firing faster, so at 150 degrees per hour for the last 100 degrees of the firing, then your final temperature is going to be 1255. So from 1237 to 1255, both are going to give you cone 6, but so if you think about, I'll talk about the difference between temperature and heat work now that Alan had mentioned earlier. So say you take, you've got temperature, which is a number at a specific point in time. So the way I like to explain it is if you're cooking a turkey or some pizza or something in the oven. So you can stick your turkey in the oven, turn the oven on, and then the oven reaches 400 degrees. At the point the oven reaches 400 degrees, is your turkey cooked yet? No, it hasn't, because it hasn't been sitting at 400 degrees for a longer period of time. So even though the oven temperature is at 400 degrees, whatever's in the oven has not been fully cooked, because the oven basically only had the amount of time to reach 400 degrees and then stop. But if you have your turkey in the oven, I don't even know what temperature you cook a turkey at, but at 400 degrees, and you leave it in the oven at 400 degrees for 5 hours, your turkey is going to be cooked much more. And the temperature in the oven is still the same. The temperature in the oven is still 400 degrees, but you've got temperature multiplied over a period of time. That is what is called heat work. And so the same goes in a kiln. So you can say, I'm going to fire my kiln to 1250 degrees Celsius. If you take your kiln and it fires as fast as possible, and then it shuts off at 1250 degrees, your pots are going to be they're going to have less heat work done to them than if you had a really slow firing. So say your firing takes 5 hours to get to 1250. Your pots aren't going to be as mature, like the clay body won't be as mature, fully vitrified, and your glazes won't be fully mature as if you had if you took a slower time to get to that same temperature. And so this is why we use cones, because cones are measuring the heat work in the firing, and cones show you visibly how much heat work. So when you unload your kiln, if your cones are still standing straight up, even though you may have reached that final temperature, it could be that your firing was too fast for your cones to start bending. And so this is why, like, just attaching a temperature number to a cone, it doesn't really, it's not giving you the full picture of what's going on. And so this is why on the cone chart, for cone 6, like it depends, like, I don't know if you can see this, but it depends whether you have small cones or large cones or self-supporting cones. All these different types of cones are going to melt at a different final temperature depending on the heating rate. So a slower firing doesn't have to go to as high of a temperature as a faster firing for the same amount of heat work to be done on your pots.
So I will get the cone now, definitely, to make sure this is all done properly.
Yes. Yeah, they're so helpful, and they just give so much more information.
Sorry, where would you place them? In the middle of the shelf? What's the idea?
Yeah, so when I recommend the first time that you use cones, I would put a cone pack on every shelf in the kiln, because then that's going to show you whether if the top of the kiln is hot or the bottom is cool, or sometimes, like my kilns, the middle is the hottest and then the top and the bottom are cooler, but every kiln is going to be different. And then the other thing is like, a kiln, if you have one shelf that has like maybe 1 plate or 2 plates on it, and then the next shelf up is like stacked with mugs, and so the amount of air circulation around, like the amount of how densely your kiln is packed is going to affect the heat work and the temperature as well. And so if you have a fairly empty kiln, it's going to get to cone 6 faster than a kiln that's like loaded full of pots, because all of the pots are absorbing the heat. And so it's going to take more energy to get a really densely packed kiln to the same temperature and like for the same amount of heat work. And so, yeah, Jacqueline in the comments said evenly and densely packed kiln equals happy heat work as well. And so, yeah, if your kiln is is loaded quite evenly, so it's not like one shelf is really full and then another shelf is kind of empty. That's going to even out the temperature throughout the kiln. And so I definitely recommend like putting a cone pack on each shelf to begin with, and then, you know, every now and then do it again, because it can explain a lot of, like, you know, someone posted recently that the pots on the top and the bottom of their kiln were, I think something happened with the glaze, but not in the middle. And so my response was like, yeah, put a cone pack on each shelf, because it could be that the top and the bottom are getting much hotter than the middle, or not reaching temperature, depending on like what the issue is. So Jacqueline asks, do you add kiln furniture if there are fewer pieces in the kiln? Yeah, this is something that I have done. So say you're loading the kiln and then you get to the top, and you don't have quite enough to fill the top shelf. Yeah, I was taught to put bricks throughout the kiln, just to kind of even out the firing, so that there's something absorbing the heat, just so that the top is even compared to like the middle and the bottom of the kiln. Larry says he places a thermocouple probes in the holes at the top and bottoms to regulate temperature. Yeah, and that's a good idea as well, because if you have more than one thermocouple, so in my manual kilns, my kiln sitter kilns at home, I do have a thermocouple with a digital pyrometer that I stick in one of the peeps. But having more than one thermocouple is gonna help you to see how evenly your kiln is firing. Sometimes I'll just like pull it out and move it into a different peep and just let it sit there for a bit if I'm trying to just make sure, like, because sometimes I have glazes that really need to get to a hot cone 6, and but they're not on the shelf that I can see through the cones through the peep, and so I'll move that thermocouple around just to see if the top or the bottom is hotter than the middle. Or
so no reason why not to use thermocouple for digital kilns.
They already have thermocouples, and they're those little probes that are sticking into the kiln, and those are censoring the temperature. So it looks like, you know, it looks like a white pen.
Right. Yeah, I understand where those thermocouples are in my kiln, but I'm just like, one of my thinking, and I could be completely wrong, could be just other things, is that my kiln is firing too hot with so if my thermocouples are not working properly, then that would be the reason why my kiln is firing too hot.
So yeah, going back to your kiln firing too hot, and it's the same with like temperature versus heat work. So your kiln has been programmed where you can say fast glaze firing cone 6, and so it's telling the kiln to fire to a certain temperature that whoever made the kiln programmed that temperature in. But it is common for the setting in the kiln program to be inaccurate compared to the cones. And what you can do is, your kiln has a function called cone offset. Okay. And so that is how you can go in and you can tell your kiln, when you tell it to fire to cone 6, you actually want it to fire 10 degrees lower than what it's programmed to, and it's quite common to have to do that. So it's not that your kiln isn't working properly, it's just that you kind of, once you get your kiln into your own environment and with your pots, then you just need to kind of calibrate it so that it's working well. And so what I would do, the best way to do this is to stick cones in your kiln where you can see them through the peeps, and then be there at the end of the firing, and you're watching the cones fall and you're looking at that temperature readout. And so when you see that your cone 6 is bending, then you're like, and your kiln isn't ready to shut off yet, then you can record that temperature that's on the readout.
Yeah.
And then you can set
Shut
your
the kiln
kiln to move into the next phase, like the next segment. So I forget
And-
what.
Yeah, and shut
button
the
you
kiln off at that point.
Yeah, shut it off. And then once your kiln has cooled, then you can reprogram it.
Yeah.
So whatever that temperature is, then you reprogram it to fire to that lower temperature next time.
Yeah, and then the other question I had about that is I have a kiln vent that's automatically, it's plugged in, it's wired into my controller. So as soon as I start my kiln, the vent starts going, and
Yeah.
I'm having the idea that I think what I want to do is get a switch in between so I can manually control when it starts and then when it ends as well, because it ends and then it's still sucking out air, so it cools very slowly compared to what it would, or it cools faster than what it would cool if I was able to just cut that switch.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes I'm not in the, and that's probably kind of crazy, but I really think that it's all safe and everything. I guess maybe I think it's too safe, but sometimes I'm not there. I'm even gone away to work or something like that. So
yeah, I don't think it's a problem to have your vent on while the kiln's cooling, but and especially with cone art kilns, is that what you said you have?
Yeah.
The bricks are so thick that they take 2 days to cool anyways. And like my little scut kiln at home is cool in like 8 to 10 hours. And pots don't need to cool that slowly. Like I think it's another myth that pots need to cool so slowly or else they're gonna crack. They can, if the cooling is controlled, so it's not like they're really hot and then a burst of cold air, like that's gonna shock them. But if the temperature just decreases evenly but really quickly, your pots are gonna be just fine.
And it doesn't change the effects of the glaze or what the glaze might be?
I mean, so the rate of your cooling cycle can have an effect on the glazes, and it depends on your glaze composition. So a glaze that is crystallizing during the cooling cycle, so glazes that contain rutile or titanium, they are affected by the length of the cooling cycle because they have these microcrystals that grow during the cooling cycle. So at the top temperature of the firing, the glaze is completely liquid and glossy, and then during the cooling cycle, these little tiny, like the molecules start to organize themselves and create these little crystal patterns. And those crystals can show up, they can look like crystals, or they can just be like streaks through the glaze or different colors appearing in the glaze surface. And that all happens during the cooling cycle. So if your kiln cools faster, it could have an effect, not necessarily a negative effect.
Yeah.
Yeah. It just could have an effect on the appearance of your glaze. So that would be something, to pay attention to.
Thank you.
Yeah. So it's 11:04 here in Victoria, British Columbia. So we've been on here for 2 hours. So I think I'm going to cut you all loose for the rest of the day. But it's been a great chat as always. I've really enjoyed talking to all of you and seeing some new faces in here. So I am going to do this again next week. And next week, I'm going to do it on a Saturday instead of a Friday, because I've been getting emails. I got one from Carol, but I've been getting a lot of emails from people who just can't make this time. So I'm going to switch it to Saturday. And then I'm also going to do it, it'll be the afternoon, my time. And this is for the Australians who it's like 4 in the morning for them right now. So I'm going to do it a little bit later in the day so that it'll be like Sunday morning for them.
Wow, great.
Yeah, just to give them a chance.
For Belgium, it's 8 o'clock now. So if you make 4 hours, then it will be a late night show or so.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so it'll never work for everyone. But I'm doing, I'm trying to be inclusive and include the whole world at some point. And then the week after, I'm going to go back to Friday. So, yeah. So hopefully, all of you Europeans will. You can either stay up really late, or you can catch me next time. So happy Easter weekend if you celebrate Easter, and it was really nice to chat with all of you, and I hope to see you again next weekend. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sue.
Bye all.
You're welcome.
Bye for now.
Thank you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.